It's just a technique. It allows and gives you the right to build connection. Then you've had a good meeting, you've had good rapport. The only friend you have is repetition, right? Through making decisions, through seeing the consequences, feeling the discomfort and doing it all over again. The question is, what's the headline? If the audience wants to remember one thing, what is it?
It's so insightful and a powerful reminder of the role of that preparation. I'm Dr. Amy Athey. As a licensed psychologist and performance expert, working with elite athletes, C-suite executives, and high performers operating in some of the most demanding environments, I've seen what it truly takes to perform when it matters most. From supporting members of the Naval Special Warfare community to advising leaders in high-stakes, high-pressure situations, one truth remains consistent. The tools that drive performance are the same. You prepare in a way that allows you to show up ready when the moment arrives. Each week, I'll share practical tools and insights to help you strengthen how you think, lead, and perform. Welcome to Still Evolving. Today's conversation lives at the intersection of two capacities that separate leaders who navigate complexity well from leaders who quietly get lost inside of it. These are clarity and judgment. Both are talked about constantly. Both are exercised far less often than most executives assume. Let me start with clarity. Most people treat clarity as the absence of complexity, as if the goal is to reduce every situation until the messiness is gone. That is not what clarity is. Real clarity is the discipline of holding all the complexity and then deciding deliberately what matters most and leading with that. It is an act of editing under pressure, not an act of avoidance. The leaders who do this well have often walked a long road to get there, because our natural instinct as leaders, especially the ones who love to unravel a hard problem, is to keep layering the analysis until we have proven to ourselves how thoroughly we understand the terrain. That process is genuinely useful, but it is not what the room needs from us. The room needs the headline, the evidence that makes it credible, and a clear ask of what to do next. Everything else belongs behind the scenes. In my book, Moment Ready, I write about the four capacities that allow high performers to show up well when the moments that matter most arrive. These are composure, clarity, connection, and courageous action. Clarity is the second of those, and it works as a bridge between the first and the last. Without clarity, leaders who are otherwise strong performers end up stuck in the middle of a big moment, well-regulated on the outside, but paralyzed on the inside because the picture of what actually matters has never been distilled into something they can act on. Clarity is what turns the noise into the decision, our ability then to take deliberate action. The second topic of today's conversation is judgment, and this is where the conversation gets particularly interesting for moments that we are in now. Information has never been more abundant. Frameworks have never been more accessible, and every question a leader might ask has been answered in some form, somewhere online, and now with generative AI agents that can be summoned in seconds. What all of this access does not give us is judgment. Judgment is not accumulated, it is earned. It is built through repetition, through the decisions made under real high stakes, through the slow accumulation of consequences that have shown up when you have been in the room enough times to feel the difference between an obvious pattern and a subtle one. The concern that runs through today's conversation, and one that I share, is that our very tools that make our lives easier may be quietly hollowing out the practice ground where judgment used to get built. If we outsource too much of our thinking, we lose the reps that would have otherwise trained us to think well in moments that tools cannot help us with. What I find so compelling is how clarity and judgment reinforce each other over time. Clarity gets easier when your judgment has been well trained because you have seen enough patterns to know quickly what actually matters. Judgment gets sharper when clarity has been well practiced because the act of deciding what to lead with over and over again teaches you to see the shape of a decision more accurately the next time. Neither one is built in a single meeting or in a single reading. Both are built in the accumulated repetitions of a career, and they are built most reliably by leaders who take time to reflect on those reps after they happen, rather than simply moving on to the next one. That is the through line of today's conversation. It is delivered by a guest who has spent years across cultures and continents refining exactly this practice. My guest today is Harsha Imrapur, and Harsha is a global business leader with more than 2 decades of experience helping organizations translate complex ideas into decisions that hold up in real conditions. He has led teams across the United States, Europe, and Asia, working with clients at the executive level on some of the most challenging transformations in their industries. His path has taken him through global consulting, enterprise technology, and advisory work, and he brings a particular rare combination to that experience, which is the analytical depth of a complex thinker, paired with the practical discipline of someone who has learned to communicate across every culture and context that he has stepped into. He is known for helping leaders separate signal from noise and decisions where the stakes are high and the answer is not obvious. And he is generous about the mistakes that have taught him how to do that. What makes him exactly the right voice for a conversation anchored in clarity and judgment is that he has felt the cost of getting both of them wrong. And he has done the work of building both of them back up, and he brings the clarity of thought about how the next generation of leaders will need to develop these capacities that is well worth your time. Harsha, welcome to Still Evolving. I'm grateful to have you here.
Thank you, Amy, for having me. Look forward to the conversation today as well.
Awesome. Harsha, you have in your journey led global teams. You've also led teams that are in the midst of what many could argue like very complex, fast-paced, dynamic pressures. So today I really wanted to hone in and better understand kind of some of the lessons learned in your journey about what works in that discipline, specifically when things are really complex. And perhaps, as humble leaders will say, we don't always have all the answers. And so what have you found to really help you in those complex dynamic conditions?
Yeah, it's a fascinating question, Amy, because we don't have all of the answers. In fact, there are more questions than answers when you come to sort of the topics that don't seem that obvious, right? So when you work across cultures, especially when you're straddling between the US on one side, which dominates a lot of the capitalist sort of conversations we have today with customers, and that seems to become the pattern that we start following elsewhere in the world. And you come into Europe, for example, and you have 27 different countries and microcultures, and you want to sort of apply that template, it can get very, very complex. I think the first thing that I've learned is you need to understand what credible means in every culture before you even walk into the room, because I had this experience back in 2010 and 11 when I was in Germany, for example, and I've been lauded for being a direct, fast, sort of decisive person in my career. So I take this first client meeting in Germany and I give a very sharp, punchy recommendation and 3 slides, and as a conclusion, there's, hey, call to action. And the room went really quiet. And, to me, I thought they were impressed. They had no questions. They had no comebacks. They were really impressed, right? I figured that out later the hard way that they weren't, right? In fact, one of them told me they were slightly offended because, it was not the recommendation that I gave, but by the speed at which I moved in the room to give that recommendation. Because in German culture, as I found out later, a recommendation delivered that fast just signals that you haven't thought through the topic very deep enough, and you've not engaged with multiple people to figure the answer out, right? So in a high context culture like the Germans, where credibility lives in the nuances, in the details. The process of arriving at the answer is itself part of the evidence that you're trustworthy and you're thoughtful and you're credible, right? And I just walked in performing the absolute wrong way in that specific culture. So I think credibility in every culture therefore matters, and understanding what it means in the room that you're walking into matters a lot. The second thing I've learned is all of us have our defaults in terms of how we operate.
Yeah.
By default, I always operate in the expert mode because I tend to appear like the one who knows most of the things. That's my default. That's how I behave, or I or I walk into a room, but then it just doesn't work. You have to switch not your core values, but the way you communicate, the way you pace yourself, the way you register the audience, and the way you intonate. I think all of that needs to change to the room, right? So being intentional about it matters, because there are moments in my meetings where I start being very intentional, but somewhere in the meeting I switch to my default, which doesn't sort of begins to break the meeting, and then I have to intentionally recognize it and switch back. And that's my last learning, right? Don't switch, don't keep switching. Once you've read the room, you stay consistent, and that takes a lot of practice, because switching styles just signals inauthenticity at every level, and I've learned it the hard way. So I think this is where the complexity lies, Amy, according to me. It's not about preparing a pitch. It's not about coming up with a great solution to problems. It's really about then how do you understand the context? How do you intentionally adapt your style, and don't fall back into your defaults through that entire process. That is a very difficult and complex thing individually and personally for me as well.
It's so insightful, and I think a powerful reminder of the role of that preparation. Oftentimes in our performance domains, I've worked across sport, military, and now predominantly in private industry. And when we think of preparation, everyone initially goes to the performance domain, knowledge, skills, and abilities. So in sport, it's let's go run that offense over and over and over, or throw the ball until we hit our target consistently. Military, let's jump out of a plane 15 times today and rehearse these skills. And then in private industry, maybe it's that pitch presentation, perhaps it's the role play of the negotiation, or to your point, the knowledge base of preparing the deck or the recommendation. But how we show up in those key moments that matter requires more than just that performance domain expertise. And you're highlighting it's how we execute and how we show up in those moments. So I'm very excited. My book's coming out tomorrow. I'm Moment Ready, shameless plug. And where I talk about 4 key tools in that moment that matters. 1, the tool of composure, how we can regulate our own energies, and then also lead with the energy that's going to most meet the demand or the context in which we're showing up in. The role of clarity, we talked about the complexity, and I hear for you the clarity that came in understanding the people and their individual backgrounds and how that influences the process of conversation in the room, to be able to, for the third C, connect, be able to connect with those people and the purpose, and take the courageous action, the 4th C, that really helps us be able to access all of that performance domain expertise and show up in the way that feels authentic and certainly brings out our best self. So with those 4 C's, this clarity that came from you that helps, I guess, signal what is most important. In that moment, it may be connecting with those people, as you mentioned, across cultures, perhaps. But in what other ways have you seen the role of clarity become such a significant tool for you leading in complex environments, or perhaps you've observed in other leaders?
Again, another great question. And I did speak about my experience the last time we spoke. Amy, my mentor, and she used to rubbish my presentations all the time, and send me back every time. That the feedback I was receiving was, from a complexity standpoint, you've really layered in your way of thinking and how you came to the conclusion. That's not the problem. The problem is understanding who you're delivering this idea or this concept, and how are you communicating the idea across rooms. That's where the issue is. And then the insight for me was, clarity isn't the absence of complexity, right? It is not. It's the discipline of actually deciding what matters most and leading with that. And I'm a complex thinker, so a complex creative, if you will. And if I didn't learn how to simplify, then I've always had these moments where I'm only talking to myself all of the time, right? Very early on in my career, because it's so complex. You want to unravel things, and the only person who seems to have empathy is yourself, and you keep sort of talking to yourself. But that's a skill that one should learn as well. The real sort of intellectual work isn't in building that argument layer by layer and really unraveling complexity. It's actually editing it down to what another person can hold in their head. So when I sit down these days after having spent so many nights wondering how I should navigate clarity from complexity, and this is sort of the mentoring that I've received from a few of our from my mentors in my life. The question is, what's the headline? If the audience wants to remember one thing, what is it? And for example, if it was, hey, look, this solution will allow you to take pricing decisions 50% in 50% of the time, 80% of the time, right? So if that was my headline for the audience, now I have to look for supporting evidence that makes that headline credible. Yes, I have implemented it for you in this region. I have tested it for all types of scenarios and the model doesn't break. And then I have built a number of reusable frameworks that will allow this framework to be implemented across the globe. Some such thing, some messages like that which support the headline makes it more trustworthy. And then the third thing I always ask my teams and myself is, what do you want this audience or this person listening to you to do? What's the action you want them to take, or what is the decision you want them to take after having seen this piece of content, right? So in a typical sort of life, you have a PowerPoint deck in many cases and you flip through a lot of these things and you don't expect people to take decision on every slide, but you have to chain some of those thoughts into a decision framework. So essentially those are my three tool sets I lead with when I think of clarity these days, whether it's a deck or whether it's a narrative in a room or a compelling sort of persuasive pitch that you make. It's the headline that matters. It's the evidence that supports the headline that matters. Are you giving them enough evidence? And what do you want them to do after listening to you? If people take care of some of these three things, and if they can answer that within a minute of you asking those questions, then there is clarity. If I don't get that answer within 60 seconds, then I know there is work. And not to take away all of the context of the culture and the people and reading the room and all of that, but that comes later once you have a clear message on hand to deliver.
And so that process for you, it sounds as if that is part of the preparation, right? And
Yes.
honing in and the what and then the how, as you mentioned earlier, perhaps the dynamics, the communication, the individual differences across culture certainly comes into the execution part. You mentioned your team, Harsha. I'm curious about your experience working with a team in that preparation process, or perhaps even in a high stakes decision moment. What has been in your experience with the role of connection with those team members to be able to facilitate that execution? Or is that, in your mind, rapport? Could you speak a little bit about the role of connection for you with your team and perhaps maybe client base as well?
I think it's very, very important, Amy. Connection is sort of the bedrock of everything that we do, isn't it? And whether it's with your other team members or with clients, because you all work, in an ecosystem that facilitates an outcome. And if I really think about rapport and connection, I feel people sometimes confuse between the two, at least in my opinion. And my team, many a times, think of rapport as connection and vice versa. And they come to me and then they say, look, I've had this great chat with a person who wants to buy something from us, and I think we can convert that, right? So in my view, that's just rapport. It's just a technique. It allows and gives you the right to build connection. It just makes someone feel good in the moment they're speaking to you. And if you have had a great conversation, if there's a bit of laughter, there's back and forth, there are no awkward silences, and you just bounce off each other well, then you've had a good meeting, you've had good rapport. But that is just the start. How do you build a connection using that foundation? Because you've had great meetings where there's great rapport, but there's no outcome after that. There's absolutely no follow through. But there are meetings where, they start off rough and they go all over the place, but then you understand the individual. You make the room feel that they are being understood by you, and you deliver on your commitments. You do the hard things to make things successful. That builds credibility and that brings connection as well. So keeping sight of that rapport gives you the right, but then delivering on your commitments, following through, doing the hard stuff, showing up when nobody shows up, right? When it's hard. I think that's the most important thing in building connection with people, at least in my experience. And it's probably the same across cultures. I've not seen a big difference when you come to connection across cultures. So yeah, making sure the team understands that, and people kind of know when you're performing warmth versus it's an act. People can see through that.
Yeah.
So making sure the team, and when we are in front of customers, they feel that we are genuine and genuinely curious about their situation, genuinely empathetic about what we can do for them, is something that needs to be on the reminder pretty much every day for us.
Absolutely. I appreciate that, showing up when it's hard, right? And sometimes that is the messy meeting, right? Where perhaps there's frustration being shared or it feels more tense. Rapport certainly is one of the skills that can help strengthen and even repair, perhaps if there's a misstep. But being able to actively like sit and listen and be present and curious to the pain that's before you, perhaps better taking a shift in your own perspective, trying to be able to see it from their lens if there is a point of conflict. That power of perspective taking can be so powerful in that connection building, as you were describing. I'm kind of reminded, when I was much younger, I had a mentor remind me, and this is more in my personal life than professionally, but certainly we have relationships that this may occur in our work life too. But they said, always show up for funerals, weddings, here and there if you can make it, right? Like, but you always are there if there's a loss. And so that kind of goes back to your point of when it's hard, you got to show up. You got to show up to build.
100%. And yeah, I think there's a very simple test for that, right? If you are the person that your clients call you when things are hard and you have connection with them, you do have connection. And some of these are very simple giveaways, right? But when things do, you know that the client is in trouble, a program is not going to plan, they're falling behind, they're out of budgets, they are getting yelled at by people around the company. You know all of that, but still you haven't received that call. It does show that you haven't really built that connection. But yeah, in a corridor when you meet those people, they have a great laugh with you, you great rapport, but you don't have connection yet. So I think 100%, I think you show up when it gets hard and you be there for people when it gets hard, then yeah, it builds a tremendous amount of credibility.
Harsha, we've talked about the role of preparation, both for the what and the how, like how we can leverage clarity, the tool of clarity, to build kind of, as you were talking, like honing on what's most important, and even when things are complex, and certainly understanding the role of culture when we are executing and then having that connection. I'm curious if you could pass down to the next generation of leaders. Today we see every time I turn around, there's like this quick hack or this next tool, but over your journey, it has been a grind. And in the midst of that, perhaps if you're early in your career and you're drawn to the next quick tool, what advice would you give to that next generation? Or are there worries that you have that they may be missing in this hurry up and find the next thing to improve efficiency, for example? But what do you worry that they may miss?
Oh, it's a loaded question, Amy. Lots of ideas come to mind. But let me peel the onion, in layers. The first thing is, I see today's leaders, they have the gift of a lot of tools and now AI and frameworks, and everything is accessible on their fingertips. It's very easy to learn. I don't think we can complain that we don't have access to information or intelligence these days, right? Very, very powerful tools. But information isn't judgment. And judgment comes by practice, and judgment comes from failure of having been there, done that. And it's today you have so much of information. I get reminded of our open book exams, right? At school, there were subjects and professors who used to challenge us. They said, bring any book in the world you want, but yeah, you've got maybe 3 questions and only 3 questions, and you've got 2 hours to figure out an answer. And yeah, you might feel that you had all the knowledge in the world right in front of you, but you don't know where to look for answers, right? And it was never a straight answer. You had to be able to understand what's written there and be able to connect the context and the dots to come up with the answer, right? Today, most leaders have that challenge. They have information, they have access to a lot of things very quickly, but I fear that the judgment part is suffering because of that. So when the stakes are high, you always want to look for a template. right? Your fallback is, oh, is there a template that people have used to solve this problem? Because it's ambiguous.
Right.
And unfortunately, nothing prepares you for that moment, through reading or accessing books or looking through information. The only friend you have is repetition, right? Through making decisions, through seeing the consequences, feeling the discomfort and doing it all over again. Right. So when we pitched to clients many years ago, it was a very large program, and we're going through a big decision architecture. There were teams in Benelux, there were teams in DACH, there were teams in the US, UK, everybody trying to sort of then make their own decisions, but it's a fairly large program they were deciding for, and stakeholders spread all across. And every time you walk into a certain room, the decision architecture is different, the culture is different, the consensus architecture is different. So you repeat all of that, but there was no time to actually prepare for every room. So you kept showing up based on a template. And the first or the second time it worked, but the third, fourth, fifth time, you fail to read the room. And, in some cultures, directness works in your favor, like the Dutch culture. But in a German culture, we spoke, it's a high context culture, details matter. But in the UK, again, it's a low context culture. They just want to get to the bottom of what you're trying to say very quickly, right? So we failed. And only through all of these repetitions, we come to know that when there is a program like this, obviously we'll have to prepare accordingly, right? So I feel for the next generation, a lot of AI and ChatGPT is hurting critical thinking and taking away all of the practice. So putting yourself out there and putting a little bit of practice in the field and learning from it is perhaps my urge to the next generation. And that brings me to the routine that subconsciously or consciously I am forced to follow now, because there's just so much of bias now in us about a topic. So I try to reset every Friday. So it's like the reset button, and you try to put some time in your calendar to sort of question your assumptions and really look at, the performance gap, as we call it, right? So I wanted this to happen in a certain situation, and it didn't happen. Why not? What was the gap? And what have I learned that I would want to repeat next week, and so on and so forth, right? Sounds extremely simple, but it's just incredibly hard to be consistent at it week after week. So I feel some of these simple things, if done consistently over a period of time, will yield a lot more impact than just reading another article, just accumulating knowledge, right? You just don't have the hardening of all of that experience in your routines. So I urge for the next generation that they build a little bit of thoughtfulness and intention in how to reset their assumptions, question their assumptions, because of all the things that we read and all the information that's coming at us. It's equally, the faster we are building a lot of bias as well, and we're falling prey to assumptions. So those would be the two sort of takeaways from my end.
You're like speaking my language. I am so aligned with all that you're sharing. There's plenty of information, but we are going to have to get the reps and get out there and have the conversations, and only by the actions are we going to be able to learn from those experiences. I love the deliberate reset, and want to echo that as well. We talk often on the show about what is an immediate and actionable strategy that enables our leaders to sustain that high performance over time, and the ability to kind of pause and have an opportunity to reflect and adapt, right? I love the questions you're asking. You mentioned the performance gap, what's going on there. We talk about the role of a balanced critique tool. So it's intentionally non-judgmental, taking an opportunity to reflect on those experiences as data, if you will. So what's one thing I want to keep doing, and what's one thing I want to do differently? And you're absolutely right. By the deliberate rehearsal of an adaptation, right? Like implementing those actions over time, that is where you see leaps and bounds of growth occur. So Harsha, it's been a pleasure. I love learning from you as well, and very much appreciate you sharing your experiences and lessons learned with us today. Thank you for joining me on Still Evolving.
Well, thanks a lot for again having me. It was lovely speaking to you, and I hope you continue to inspire and teach the next generation and the generations after that with all your wisdom, because this is not something that people talk about a lot. And I hope the 4C framework, I resonate a lot with that. So hopefully I think the next generation also sort of really intentionally thinks about communication, clarity, the way they show up, and how they contextualize every time they show up. Thanks for having me again.
Thank you so much.